Listen. There are stories that sound too strange to be true, and yet they are carved into history. Pharaohs claimed to be gods, emperors demanded worship, kings wore crowns of gold to prove their strength. But there was one king who believed he was made of glass. Charles VI of France, crowned as a boy, destined to rule a kingdom at war, and yet he lived every day haunted by a terror unlike any other. He believed his body could shatter. One touch, one stumble, one wrong move, and the King of France would break into 1,000 glittering pieces. This is the story of the Mad King, a fragile crown on a fragile man. The year was 1380. A boy stood in the great cathedral of Rheims. He was only 11, too young to truly understand the weight of the world about to be placed on his shoulders. The crown of France gleamed above him, heavy with jewels, ancient with history, a crown forged by the blood of kings and blessed by the church. As priests chanted and incense filled the air, the boy's head bowed. The crown descended, and with it the destiny of a kingdom. That boy was Charles VI. To his people he was hope. The 100 Years' War had bled France nearly dry. Nobles quarreled, peasants groaned under taxes, and English armies prowled their borders. And so, when the crown touched his young brow, the people whispered, "Perhaps this king will heal us." But fate is not kind. Charles carried not only a crown, but a fragile mind. At first, the signs were small. Sudden rages, deep silences, strange moods that swept over him like storms. The court excused them. A boy is allowed to be unpredictable. But with each passing year, the shadows grew darker. Until one day, the delusion took hold. Charles came to believe that he was made of glass. Not metaphorical glass, not poetic glass, no. He truly believed his body could shatter at any moment into 1,000 glittering pieces. He ordered his robes to be padded with layer upon layer of cloth so no one could touch him directly. He refused to sit for long, convinced the weight of the throne itself might splinter his bones. He moved carefully, step by cautious step, as if each stride might be his last intact one. Servants were forbidden to come too close. Courtiers bowed from afar. Even his doctors, men of learning, could do little but nod, whisper, and obey. Imagine it, the halls of the French palace, once filled with laughter, politics, and music, now reduced to silence. Guards tiptoeing, maids whispering, ministers exchanging nervous glances as their king, their God-given ruler, shuffled past, wrapped in layers of cloth, terrified of breaking. And yet, outside those walls, the world raged on. The 100 Years' War thundered. France's enemies pressed harder. Its nobles clawed at power, using the king's madness as a weapon. His uncles and his queens circled like hawks, ruling in his name, but each for their own gain. What happens when a kingdom's strength rests on a man who fears the very air that touches him? The truth was cruel. France fractured. Loyalties split. The king's fragile mind mirrored his fragile kingdom. And so, the boy crowned in golden hope became known by another name, Charles the Mad. But behind that title was not a monster, not a tyrant, but a man trapped inside his own fear. A king who wore silk and gold on the outside, and terror, raw and human, on the inside. His crown was real. His power was real. But to Charles, it was all as delicate as glass. Kings are supposed to be strong, untouchable, divine. They wear crowns of gold, wield swords of iron, and command nations with their words. But what happens, pause, when a king believes he is made of glass? Fragile, breakable, one touch away from shattering into 1,000 pieces. This was the fate of Charles VI of France, a king who should have been a symbol of strength, but instead became a prisoner of his own fragile mind. At first, his madness came like storms, sudden, violent. He would rage through the palace halls, his eyes wide, his voice trembling. Once, he even attacked his own knights in a frenzy, striking without reason, convinced they were traitors plotting his death. The court whispered in fear. Their king was losing himself. But then came something stranger, something quieter, a delusion no one could have imagined. He began to believe his body was made of glass. Glass! A king of France, convinced that the slightest touch, the smallest fall, would shatter him forever. Shh! Imagine the sight. Charles, wrapped in layers of padded clothing, thick quilts, cushions tied to his limbs, as if armor against the world. Not iron, not steel, but softness, protection from his own imagination. He refused to let anyone near him. Servants were forbidden to touch him. Courtiers had to bow from a distance. Even his children, his wife, could not embrace him. A father, a husband, and yet untouchable. Sometimes he would sit perfectly still for hours, terrified to move. He whispered, "Do not come near me. Do not touch me. I will break." His throne became a prison, his kingdom a cage of fear. And France? France was already bleeding. The 100 Years' War raged on. English armies threatened the land. Nobles plotted. The people starved. And at the heart of it all was a king who could not be touched, a king who believed he was glass. The irony, a crown of gold, yet a body of glass, a symbol of power, yet the most fragile man in his kingdom. Doctors came. They bled him, dosed him with potions. Priests came. They prayed, exorcised, begged God for mercy. Sorcerers came. They chanted, whispered charms into the night, but nothing worked. His madness held him tight, unshakable, unbreakable in its own cruel way. And the court, oh, the court did not know whether to laugh or to weep. Some mocked him behind closed doors, others pitied him, but all feared him. For how can you question a king even when he believes he is glass? And yet, perhaps there was meaning in his madness. For was not France itself fragile, cracked by war, fractured by betrayal, ready to break with the slightest blow? The king's mind was a mirror of his kingdom, both delicate, both fragile, both one touch away from shattering. The glass delusion was not just madness, it was a story, a warning, a haunting reminder that even kings, even crowns, even empires are not as unbreakable as they seem. Listen closely, for when glass breaks, it cannot be repaired. And when a king shatters, so too does his kingdom.
What does it feel like to believe you are glass? To sit on a throne, crowned with gold, robes flowing, while inside your heart beats with terror that a single touch, a single stumble could shatter you into 1,000 glittering shards. This was the prison of Charles VI. In his mind, he was no longer a king of flesh and bone. He was brittle, transparent, his body a cage of fragile crystal. He would whisper to his servants, "Stay back, do not touch me, or I will break." Shh! Imagine the silence of his chamber. Curtains drawn, the king wrapped in heavy cushions. He would not rise. He would not walk. He feared even the act of sitting down too hard. Sometimes he believed parts of his body had already cracked. He would clutch his sides, his arms, begging his physicians to repair the fractures only he could feel. They tried everything: potions, herbs, prayers, even charms whispered at midnight. But the glass did not vanish. And yet, inside his delusion, there was order, there was meaning. Charles was not only afraid of breaking, he was afraid of chaos. His mind, fragile as it was, mirrored the fragile state of France itself. Nobles rebelled, the English invaded, famine spread through the land. The kingdom, like glass, always on the edge of breaking. Perhaps in his madness, Charles saw more truth than anyone dared to admit. Inside the king's mind, reality twisted. At times, he forgot his own name. He would wander the halls of his palace, whispering that he was not Charles, not king, not even human. He would run through the gardens like a wild man, calling out to strangers as though the crown had vanished from his head. Shh! And then he would break down, trembling, refusing to be touched, convinced his body was fragile glass. To live inside Charles's mind was to live between extremes. Rages of fire and storms, and then silence, fear, and fragility. The world outside him was loud with war, betrayal, and politics, but inside was only glass. And this fear shaped everything around him. Guards had to keep distance. Servants bowed without approach. Even his family, his wife, his children were forbidden to embrace him. A king surrounded by people, yet completely untouchable. Imagine being that king. A father who cannot hold his son. A husband who cannot touch his wife. A ruler who fears his own body. It was not just madness. It was loneliness. A loneliness sharper than any sword. Inside the king's mind, the throne was made of gold, but his world was made of glass. And glass, a king may be fragile, but a kingdom cannot be. France was trembling. Charles VI, the Glass King, sat upon the throne, terrified of shattering. But outside his chamber walls, the kingdom itself began to crack. Nobles whispered in the shadows, who would rule if the king could not? Who would lead the armies if the king feared even to rise from his bed? The court was divided. On one side, his uncles and brothers, hungry for power, eager to pull the strings of a broken king. On the other, his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, clever, ambitious, desperate to protect her children and her place at court. And in the middle stood Charles, fragile as glass, unable to stop them. Imagine the corridors of the palace, murmurs of conspiracy, servants spreading rumors of the king's madness, guards exchanging uneasy glances, every noble waiting, watching, circling, like wolves around a wounded stag. The people, too, suffered. Without a strong hand on the throne, famine spread. Taxes rose. Armies faltered against England in the 100 Years' War. To the common man, their God-given king had become a ghost, a man locked away, whispering of glass, while their villages burned. Fear became the language of the land. Fear of invasion, fear of betrayal, fear that God himself had cursed France with a king unfit to rule. Some priests claimed it was punishment for sin. Others whispered it was sorcery. A few even dared to say that the crown itself had shattered. And still, the court performed the rituals of power. Processions, feasts, councils, all with a king who sometimes forgot his own name. Sometimes Charles would appear in bursts of clarity, speaking like the ruler he once was. And for a moment, hope flickered, but then it would vanish. His eyes would grow distant, his hands would tremble, and the glass would return. The kingdom learned to live with his madness. Ministers ruled in his name. Alliances shifted like sand. France itself became a reflection of its king, fragile, unstable, always on the edge of breaking. A king in fear, a queen in intrigue, a court in chaos, and a kingdom in despair. This was not just the madness of one man. It was the madness of a nation bound to a ruler too fragile to stand. And France, like its king, began to crack. Power is a fragile thing. In the hands of a king who believed he was made of glass, it became shattering. Charles VI still wore the crown of France, but it no longer carried the weight of command. Some days he rose from his bed convinced he could rule. Some days he refused to move, whispering that if anyone touched him, he would break into shards. And the court had to pretend that this was still a king. When the throne stood empty, even when a king sat upon it, others reached for its power, and those hands were greedy. The dukes moved first. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry, stepped forward as protectors of France. Noble words, but beneath the velvet cloaks were wolves.
They seized estates, drained the treasury, enriched themselves while peasants starved and soldiers went unpaid. When Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's own brother, entered the game, the fire spread. Louis was young, clever, and ambitious. He whispered promises to Queen Isabeau, swore that he alone could defend the kingdom from greedy Burgundy. To some, he was salvation. To others, he was poison. Shh! And the palace filled with rumors that Louis and the Queen shared more than counsel, that their alliance was bound by more than politics. True or not, the whispers spread through France like wildfire, feeding resentment, dividing loyalties, sharpening daggers in the dark. And so, the crown of France split in two. On one side, Orleans and his followers, the Armagnacs, proclaiming they were the true defenders of the king. On the other, Burgundy, cunning, ruthless, claiming to protect France from corruption. Both sides claimed loyalty to Charles VI. But the king they fought for was too fragile to hold a sword, too frightened to embrace his own children. The people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the priests suffered the most. To them, a king was a bridge between heaven and earth. But their king? He was locked away, trembling, sometimes wandering the halls without recognizing his own family. And while he whispered of glass, their crops burned, their taxes soared, their sons died in wars they no longer understood. Imagine Paris, streets torn apart, not just by famine and plague, but by banners of war. In one quarter, the white cross of Burgundy, in another, the colors of Orleans. Soldiers patrolling, merchants whispering, mothers clutching children tighter as shadows of war closed in. The kingdom itself mirrored its king, fragile, fractured, breaking. And at the center of it all stood Queen Isabeau. Some saw her as the last thread holding the crown together. Others cursed her as a traitor, too close to Orleans, too eager to sell France piece by piece to save herself. Her name, once spoken with reverence, became drenched in suspicion. To the people, she was no longer their mother queen, but a symbol of corruption. Even the church weighed in. Priests thundered from pulpits. Was this madness a punishment from God? Had the crown of France been cursed? Or worse, had sorcery touched the king's soul? The whispers grew louder. Perhaps the king's glass delusion was not illness at all, but a sign that God himself had abandoned France. And still the rituals of monarchy went on. Feasts, ceremonies, councils, nobles bowing before a man who sometimes could not remember his own name. They pretended. They had to pretend. For if the crown was broken, then so was France itself. But the truth could not be hidden forever. The king's madness became their excuse, his fragility their weapon. The dukes fought not for France, but for themselves. Armagnacs against Burgundies, brother against brother, noble against noble. And in the shadows, England watched, smiling, as France destroyed itself from within. This was no longer simply the madness of a man. It was the madness of power itself, splintered, corrupted, devouring the kingdom from the inside. France bled, France trembled, and yet the crown still glittered, untouchable, untaken, balanced on the head of a king made of glass. Beyond the throne rooms and the battlefields, there was another kingdom. A kingdom hidden inside the mind of Charles VI. The outside world saw a king of glass, fragile, trembling, unable to rule, but inside his thoughts, shadows moved. Fear, paranoia, delusion, they twisted and coiled, turning his own mind into a battlefield darker than any war with England. Ah, sometimes Charles believed he was not king at all. He forgot his name, his crown, even his children. He would wander the halls of the palace, muttering, searching for something no one else could see. At times he would flee from those who loved him most, crying out that they were strangers, enemies, demons in disguise. And then came the glass. The terrible belief that his body was brittle, that the slightest touch would shatter him into 1,000 shards. Servants were forbidden to approach him suddenly. He wrapped himself in thick padded clothes. He sat stiffly, afraid to move, afraid even to embrace his own wife or children. Imagine it. The most powerful man in France, terrified of breaking like a goblet in the hand of a servant. But there were other shadows too. Some nights he saw visions, phantoms whispering in the dark. He swore that enemies plotted outside his door. He raged, struck out, even attacked his attendants in bursts of wild violence. And then, just as suddenly, he would collapse, trembling, broken, begging forgiveness. His mind was a storm, lightning and silence, rage and fear, moments of clarity when he spoke with wisdom and strength, followed by long hours of madness when even his reflection in a mirror filled him with terror. Shh! Those who served him learned to walk carefully, to whisper instead of speak, to bow but never too close. Every movement, every sound might awaken the glass inside his mind. And all the while, France waited. A kingdom needed its king. Armies needed his command. The people needed his blessing. But Charles could not give it. He was trapped, prisoner of his own thoughts, chained not in iron, but in delusion. And perhaps the saddest truth of all, Charles knew it. In his rare lucid moments, he saw what he had become. He wept for his people. He prayed for his sanity. He begged the saints to heal him. And when the shadows returned, he surrendered once more to fear. This was the hidden tragedy of France. Not just a king who was fragile, but a man broken from within. His crown rested on his head, but his mind was slipping further into darkness, a kingdom of shadows where no one could follow. And as the king vanished into his fears, France itself sank deeper into chaos.